Welcome back to Series Regular, the Hollywood Reporter's all-in podcast on genre television. Hello, everybody. I am Josh Wigler, your host here on Series Regular. And this week, we're turning our gaze once again to a brand new show, both for this podcast and for the public at large. Carnival Row, the Amazon Prime video series set to launch in its 8-episode entirety on August 30th. As we're all just about finished up with our collective Game of Thrones hangovers, okay, maybe not all of us, here comes Carnival Row, one of the newest fantasy contenders on the scene, and one that's going to be here to stay for the foreseeable future. Sight unseen to the public, Carnival Row has already been renewed for a second season on Amazon, which is a pretty strong show of confidence from the streamer. And it's easy to see why, based on the pedigree involved in the project. Orlando Bloom and Cara Delevingne are the stars of Carnival Row, with additional supporting cast members including Jared Harris, who's fresh from Chernobyl, and Indira Varma, the erstwhile Game of Thrones star responsible for noises like these. That's right, Series Regular listeners. You're never going to be truly safe from a possible Red Viper sound drop trap. Anyway, those actors and more are at the heart of Carnival Row, which takes place in a faraway fictional fantasy land where humans and mythical creatures intermingle with varying degrees of positive results. Which is to say, there are not many positive results, not a lot of harmony, at least not for the mythical creatures. Unlike Game of Thrones, and unlike some of the other bubbling Amazon fantasy projects like Wheel of Time and the upcoming Lord of the Rings series, Carnival Row does not take its cues from a book or any other kind of source material. Unless you want to count the feature film spec script written by co-creator Travis Beacham a long time ago. That script was called A Killing on Carnival Row. And while the eventual Amazon series has ditched the front half of that title, the killings are very much alive and well here. Which is a weird thing to say about killings, but I don't know, you get the picture. The upside of Carnival Row coming your way as a wholly original series? There's no one out there who knows the story ahead of time. Nobody who can spoil the red weddings of it all, or otherwise bomb your Twitter feeds and ruin the experience for you. At least not yet. You're advised to binge quickly once the series drops, which shouldn't be much of an issue, what with the fact that it's only 8 episodes and it's dropping over a long holiday weekend here in the States. What else do you have going on? We're going streaky! Yeah! But the downside is this. Carnival Row occupies a very dense and very specific universe, brimming with history and creatures and all sorts of mystical jargon that might take some getting used to. And that's what today's podcast is here to help you with. A Series Regular special with Carnival Row showrunner Marc Guggenheim, designed to ease your entry into this new series and introduce you to some of the characters, the storylines that you're going to encounter in Carnival Row. That conversation is coming your way right after the following mood setting from the Carnival Row trailer.
Our streets are safe, no more.
Inspector.
There's been another killing.
Same old, same old.
Every 3 weeks, this lunatic brings down his hammer.
We will find who was responsible.
Get going!
Is the master of the house available?
I'm master here.
The city belongs to us!
Hi, Marc. Thanks for being on the podcast with us this week.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Big week as Carnival Row is about to drop on Amazon. Nerves? Excited? How are you feeling?
Both. It's always both.
Yeah.
It's usually more nerves than excitement.
Usually more nerves than excitement.
Usually, for me, it tells you a little bit about my own psychology.
Simpatico. I mean, that's
I'm a writer,
well.
so it's probably not terribly surprising.
Yeah. So tell us a bit about Carnival Row. I think that if you've been out in the wild at all, you've been seeing a lot of ads for Carnival Row, so hopefully it's on people's radar already. But this is it's a unique show in that it's not based on any big sweeping pre-existing property. This is something that is brand new to the world, based on a feature film script, I believe, if that's right.
Yes, a feature film script called A Killing on Carnival Row, that Travis Beacham wrote. And he co-created the show with Renee Echeverria.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about the story and what we're getting into.
Basically, it's a fantasy world. We're in a city called the Burg, and it's sort of this failing empire. It's very Dickensian. It sort of looks a lot like Victorian England. And what's happening is, because of various conflicts outside of the Burg, refugees are flooding in, very much the same way like in Paris, they're seeing an influx of Syrian refugees in real life. But in our show, the refugees are actually mythological creatures, various creatures from, fairy tales, really, like pyxes and fauns and trolls and centaurs. So our Syrian refugees are fantasy creatures.
Right. It's an interesting way to get into a lot of, real world parallels. That must be something that's very exciting to explore from the writer standpoint.
Well, I think what's really interesting is Travis wrote this script 15 years ago, and they were, there was a real resonance back then, but that resonance has only grown to the point where we just happen to be, coming out just at a time when this issue is at the forefront of everyone's minds.
Right. So this is a world that's at war or is recovering from war.
Recovering. They're basically, the Berg is sort of this fading empire, kind of like, the way the British Empire lost its luster. And in an attempt to sort of, shore up their empire, they got into these conflicts with another country called the Pact.
They're ruthless.
They are ruthless.
Their handiwork is one of the very first images you see in the show.
Yes. They the Pact knows that various Pyx's fairies are trying to fly away from them, so they've strung up barbed wire in the trees to snag them and prevent them from flying, and it's pretty brutal. And the Pact also has among their resources these werewolf-like creatures called Marocs, and what they do is they actually have their own soldiers, inject themselves with an agent that basically brings about the change. So yeah, we're dealing with a villain that's not, they're not above doing some bad stuff.
And they are, at least through the episodes that I have seen, they're mostly relegated to the land from which the Fae come from, right? They've basically seized upon that place and they have taken it for their own.
Well, basically, that land of the Fae has basically been it's been a thing that both empires, both, governments have been fighting over. So they're sort of, the Fae are stuck in the middle. And now that the conflict is over and the Berg has withdrawn, leaving, these homelands really in the clutches of the Pact. So in many ways, the Berg, which is where the show takes place mainly, is responsible for this, horror that has happened to the Fae folk.
So the show takes place mostly in the Berg, which is where we get Carnival Row, the title from. Can you describe that a little bit for people?
Basically, the Berg is divided up, like most large cities are, into various different sections. And there's a neighborhood that the Fae have found themselves congregating in. Again, much the same way we see in our own world. And a stretch of that neighborhood is known, sort of just colloquially as Carnival Row.
Yeah. So we've got some very important characters at the heart of this tale who we have yet to speak about. Who would you say are the central people that we're going to be following through this show?
Well, for sure, I think, certainly from all the marketing and everything, you see that this show co-stars Orlando Bloom and Cara Delevingne, and they're very prominent, obviously. But one of the things we love about the show is it has such a wide-ranging and talented ensemble. But Orlando plays Rycroft Philostrate, who a Philo to his friends, who is a inspector for the local constabulary, and he finds himself investigating basically a series of killings. Meanwhile, Cara Delevingne's character, Vignette Stonemoss, is someone who just arrives in the Berg at the very beginning of our series. So she is one of the refugees of which we speak, and she and Philo have a rather complex romantic history.
Some history.
They do. They have a very interesting romantic history. I don't think it's spoiling anything to say that Vignette comes to the Berg having thought that Philo was killed 7 years earlier. And suffice it to say, Philo is very much alive, and Vignette will have something to say about being deceived in that way.
Sparks will fly.
Sparks definitely fly.
Alongside some of the pixies will fly as well.
There's a lot of things flying.
A lot of flying.
There's a lot of flying in this show, which is cool, actually. We have incredibly talented, stunt people designing the wire work and very talented visual effects artists painting out said wires, as well as painting in the fairy wings. There's a lot going into the show.
The names of the characters are so great. I mean, it really does have sort of it's like fantasy noir is kind of how I would describe
fantasy
Carnival
noir
Row.
is how we talk about it too.
Yeah.
And it really, one of the things I love about it is, not just the fact that it's not based on something, not some pre-existing, book or movie, but I love the fact that for a fantasy show to take place in sort of a post-industrial revolution era, I've never seen that before either. Typically, fantasy shows tend to be in a medieval or quasi-medieval setting, and what we're doing is telling a story sort of in that fantasy world that you've seen a million different times now, but advanced by, 10 to 12 centuries.
Right. It has sort of a steampunk quality about it as well.
It definitely gives it a steampunk. I would say it's like steampunk light.
Yeah.
We're not going super heavy with the steampunk, but for sure there are visual elements there that, would, I think, properly be categorized as steampunk.
Who are your favorite characters? Who stands out to you the most? Who speaks to you from the Carnival Row cast?
I cannot choose among my cast members. The truth of the matter is that what I think is great about the show is you've got Cara and Orlando, who obviously they come in with, a huge following and a huge name recognition. But then you've got other people like Tamsin Merchant or David Jesse who are not as well known, playing characters that I think will really take people by surprise. So there's a nice mix of the movie stars and the celebrities so
Jared
well.
Harris is in this.
Well, then I was going to talk about like Jared Harris and Indira Varma, who are just, actors who have, an incredible body of work behind them. And some people, like Indira, for example, who's in Game of Thrones, have that genre street cred. You've got Jared, who recently everyone knows from the amazing Chernobyl. So it's an incredibly deep bench. I mean, Simon McBurney, who is basically English theater royalty, who is playing Rupert Murdoch right now in The Loudest Voice. I mean, everywhere you look, there's a incredible actor playing a really interesting character.
Yeah.
And one of the, fun parts about the show is the way we weave in and out of these various different characters' lives. And you'll sort of see how you find yourself waiting, like, oh, when is Orlando's character going to meet Jared's character? When is, this character going to cross with that character? And that's part of the fun of the show.
Yeah. From a content perspective, even though there's fairy tale creatures littered across Carnival Row, this isn't your classic. This is maybe more of the grim fairy tale variety in terms of content. Can you speak to that a little bit? It's a violent show at times.
It's a violent show at times, not gratuitously violent. We're trying to tell a story. We're trying to use the violence to tell a story about what these fae folk are facing. And, you'll see it in the opening moments of the show with Cara's character. They are fleeing some terrible conditions and terrible violence. And rather than just talk about the terrible violence, we felt the need to dramatize it because it really is, the inciting incident for our show. And I feel like, you very diplomatically tried to get at the thing that Travis Beecham and I always get asked about, which is the fairy sex.
Yeah.
And I get that. It's funny. I think I was slightly surprised at how much of an interest that's been of the various different journalists who have interviewed us about the show. But for us, the adult nature of the show is a big part of it, insofar as it's important to really ground this world in a real and visceral way. So the violence, is real. Sex, as we know, is a part of life, and that's real. Even though these are, creatures that from fairy tales, and we associate fairy tales with, children's literature. This is, like you said, it's more the Brothers Grimm, darker, quite frankly, more European version of fairy tales.
But I think part of what that buys you too is it gives you the ability to navigate some of these very important, difficult themes that you're exploring here with the refugee crisis as well, racism within the world of Carnival Row as well.
Yeah, well, it's we like to say the show is about every way you can possibly segregate a culture. So it is about racism, but it's also about sexism and classism, and I like to say it's about every ism there is. And you see that, the show is kind of like a diamond where, depending upon which direction we turn it for the audience, you will see a different facet, not just of the world, but of an issue.
Yeah. Orlando Bloom is someone who is so known for playing these heroic roles. Pirates of the Caribbean immediately comes to mind. Legolas immediately comes to mind. How is this character different for him in playing Philo?
Well, that's one of the things I love about not just the casting of Orlando, but Orlando's performance. Because Philo is basically 180 degrees away from from Will Turner and Legolas. But, Orlando brings into the project the sort of the baggage in a good way of those roles, but he's playing a character that is much more internal, much darker, much more brooding, quite frankly. He's not being a swashbuckler by any stretch, even though he has a fair amount of action
in the first episode alone.
In the first episode alone, and by the way, that was that people haven't seen yet, but that's Orlando doing a lot of his own stunts.
That's impressive.
Yeah,
it's a lot of jumping around that's going on.
You'll see there's a slide down a roof. He slides down a roof and sort of catches a storm gutter to stop his fall, and that's Orlando.
Wow.
Yeah, it was pretty good. And the jumping across rooftops and the leaps, that is mostly him.
Yeah. And how about Kara as Vignette, who's basically your co-lead? What are we getting from this character, and what do you think that the show is really able to explore through her perspective, especially as one of the Fae?
I love the fact that Vignette, Kara's character is such a warrior. She's steely, she's tough, but at the same time, what motivates her isn't survival for herself. It's actually survival for her people, and more specifically, her people's culture. One of the things you'll learn, again, this is not a spoiler, one of the things you'll learn in the course of the series is that she, back in her homeland, was the custodian of this sacred library that really was the repository, basically, of all the knowledge of her people. And she takes being a Fae very seriously. So
Carnival Row is a show of confidence, has already been renewed for a second season, without sight unseen for the rest of the world. What does that mean to you? What should that mean to us? That's a pretty big sign of confidence.
Well, that's the thing. It really was. I mean, I think it probably demonstrates better than anything is that Amazon was the first fan of this show. They've obviously, been seeing early cuts and seeing finished cuts, and they have been incredibly supportive of it. Even before we got renewed for a second season, they've been very supportive, in terms of not just money, but anything, logistics, anything we needed to produce the show that we wanted to produce.
Yeah.
And I've never seen anything quite like it, but I think they recognize that the show has the potential to be something really special.
Yeah. When we get to the end of the first season, how thankful are we going to be that there's a second season? Are you leaving us on a note where we are really going to be, we would have been furious if there was no more?
I think so. I definitely think so. I know I, as a viewer, would not have been particularly happy.
That's a warning.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The first season, it ends, certainly certain mysteries are sewn up. You definitely will have a nice sense of closure as far as a lot of the storylines are concerned, but things happen in the final episode that really are game changers, that do set up the second season, and that will have you going like, oh my God, what happens next? one of the things I love about the way the first season is constructed is none of the characters end the season the way they began. They all find themselves in completely changed circumstances. And as someone who's, working on the second season right now, I can tell you that just creates so many wonderful story possibilities. So, it's not a traditional cliffhanger, but if we've done our job right, you'll definitely want to come back for more.
And as far as people encountering Carnival Row for the first time, do you recommend the binge? Do you think you want to slow drip this? How would you watch this if you were giving the recommendation?
That's a great question. I'm probably the wrong one to ask because I know I don't binge anything.
Yeah.
But I think, what's really nice about the way the first season is constructed, and we're doing the same thing with the second season, is even though it looks like a movie, we don't conceive of it or think of it as an 8-hour movie. Rather, we think of it as an 8-chapter novel.
Yeah.
So the answer to your question really depends upon how you like to read. Yeah, that's exactly it. If you like to curl up with a book over a long weekend and read the whole thing all the way through, you can do that with the show. The show has a very sort of literary kind of quality to it.
Yeah. Can't wait for people to check it out. I'm sure you can either.
I just hope they do.
All right. Thanks, Mark. I appreciate you being on.
Thanks a lot.
And that'll do it this week for Series Regular, the Hollywood Reporter's all-in podcast on genre television. If Carnival Row sounds up your alley, it's going to be streaming on Amazon starting August 30th. What's more, it's not the only brand new fantasy series embarking on a streaming spirit quest this week. Netflix also has The Dark Crystal: Age of Resistance coming out, which has been getting rave reviews. I've only seen the first episode, and I loved what I saw. So if you're at all a fan of that universe, based on the old 1982 Jim Henson movie, or you've seen the trailers and you're just curious, you'll be able to get your Gelfling on as soon as the episodes drop on August 30th. As always, thanks for listening to Series Regular. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to the show on your podcast app of choice. Email us at seriesregular@thr.com with your suggestions for shows to cover or any other feedback. We'll be back soon with another new episode. Until then, take care.